Hello, my name is Lee Kaplan. I'm host of Everything is Ideology, a cultural studies podcast. Today, we'll be joined by Max Blansjaar, and we'll be discussing his A Practical Guide to the Silent Disco, which was published in a 2026 volume of the Sound Studies Journal. We begin by introducing the silent disco phenomena and explaining and examining how it has been discussed in existing literature. From there, we trace a genealogy of the silent disco, situating it historically and culturally while considering the technological and spatial conditions that make it possible. The conversation then turns to the architecture and ecology of the silent disco itself, how multiple channels, DJs, and listening choices reshape the relationship between crowd and music. These technological features produce new forms of interaction, where dancers can appear synchronized yet inhabit entirely different worlds. Throughout the episode, we discuss how silent discos stage tensions between individuality and collectivity, revealing subtle dynamics around gender, visibility, and audience awareness. We also examine the role of DJs, whose presence becomes simultaneously central and strangely obscured within this headphone-mediated environment. Finally, we reflect on what silent discos might reveal about broader cultural and economic logics, from fleeting social connections and the production of social capital to the insider-outsider dynamics that structure participation. Taking together, the silent disco offers a surprising entry point into questions about contemporary identity, participation, and the neoliberal organization of social life. If you like what we do here, make sure to like and subscribe. Max Blansjaar is a musician and writer from Amsterdam, the Netherlands. He holds a BA in music from St. Catherine's College, University of Oxford, where he was awarded the Gibbs Prize by the Faculty of Music in 2024, so quite recently. His work centers around cultural politics and popular music, and the negotiation of social identities and relations through music and sound, with recent essays published in Sound Studies, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, and the Journal of Extreme Anthropology, as well as other popular magazines such as The Dirt, The Mortar, and The Story. He currently holds the Clarendon Scholarship at Jesus College and University of Oxford. So thank you so much for being here. I found your paper to be actually quite, not only just sort of well written, but actually quite humorous as well. And this is something that's particularly maybe difficult or not within academic scholarship. So the narrative in which you write is like an interesting conglomeration of it seems to be all of these various events. So you went to we'll obviously talk about your piece and whatnot, but it seems like you went to about 6, 7, or 8 different silent discos and whatnot, and then created a narrative that brings all of these central pieces and perhaps most interesting aspects of the events or the most insightful of the events into this narrative arc. So I was curious first if you could just discuss the overall project, sort of how it was written, and also I was quite struck by this was actually your undergraduate dissertation.
True, that's true, yeah.
Which is quite fantastic and amazing also, considering, I barely made it out of my undergraduate with being able to say the word phenomenology, uh, let alone use it in a paper. So yeah, if you mind discussing some of these sorts of things.
No, definitely. So, the reason that I started thinking about the silent disco is because I was a student and it was a popular student event. And I kind of couldn't figure out at first whether I loved them or I hated them. And it always seemed to be this kind of weird experience. People found them to be kind of tacky and the music to be generally kind of bad, but they also always went. And so there was this, I was like, I wonder how this is actually working. And then I in terms of, in terms of why people enjoy this, why do people keep coming back? Why is this even a thing? And so I looked up whether there was any scholarship on silent discos generally, and there wasn't really much. And the stuff that did exist seemed to me to be kind of bear a slightly strange relation to what I felt was actually happening in the room at these events. Often the writing on silent discos was kind of abstract and sort of a bit conceptual, which maybe we'll talk about. But yeah, so I thought, why don't I do a kind of ethnography style piece about how the silent disco actually works as a social event.
Yeah. No, that's really wonderful. I mean, considering some of the stuff that you talk about and the discourse you sort of push back on is it comes in sort of two forms. There's a like an over scientific modality of writing about the about the science, about the silent disco, where it's an empirical study and it also takes place outside of the context of the silent disco. That's something that you found. You found, I believe, two articles on that, which is actually, I mean, really wonderful and interesting that those occur, but it sort of happens in the frame of kind of a musicology, a music cognition thing, which is outside of the scope of dealing with something within a social context. And this is another area where you sort of add an element of humor. You're like, well, let's see, this doesn't really explain what happens in the wild, where it sort of actually occurs, right? And then the other thing that you find, this other sort of discourse on the silent disco, you sort of push back on, which I found really interesting and useful, is using the silent disco to specifically talk about like a neoliberal privatization and individualization, and the silent disco becomes a sort of symbol or token of a particular form of late stage capitalism, rather and almost as a sort of fetishization of an event rather than looking into the specific like phenomenological aspects of it. So these are two things you sort of push back on and open up the discourse within. So you're pushing back on this overly scientific sort of empirical model that takes out the sort of like human sociability of it, and also you're pushing back on just using the silent disco as to explain like this neoliberal hellscape we all live within, where it's like, we're next to each other, but we're not really next to each other, sort of thing. So if you wouldn't mind talking about some of the literature you found and the ways in which you sort of pushed back against it or expanded upon it.
Definitely, yeah. So I mean, let me take them in that order. So first of all, there's this idea in the study of music cognition, essentially, which has been used a couple of times in music cognition studies, which is this idea of the silent disco paradigm, quote unquote, the silent disco paradigm, which is where you put people in a lab and you give them headphones that play the same or different music, and then you study the effect of that music on, entrainment with one another, empathy, like interpersonal connection, and all of these things. And in fairness to these studies, like they're not claiming to actually say anything about silent disco events like the ones I attended in the club, right? So what they're really interested in is how different individuals entrain with one another and musically, and what the effect is of this on their mood and on their relationship to one another, right? So they may yield kind of useful insights in that regard. What they're not really saying is anything about silent disco events as such. And in that way, the phrase silent disco paradigm is kind of misleading because it kind of just means headphones in that context, right? And then there's the other one the other kind of genre of literature that I sort of push back on a bit, which, as you say, is more of a kind of, I guess, like a critical theory way of looking at the silent disco, which takes it as evidence for a kind of a wider movement in the way that people socialize with one another. So for these writers, thinking about like Robin James did an article about this, and Mark Doze and others. For them, the silent disco as a phenomenon is kind of symptomatic of the way people relate to one another under neoliberalism or late-stage capitalism or what have you. So the idea is that people are kind of alone together and separated from one another, and kind of exercising control over their own kind of virtual spaces, and the virtual spaces aren't really overlapping and this kind of thing. And the main problem that I had with this kind of literature, and again, they are making some very valid points about neoliberal sociality that exists and is a thing, but my issue with them is that it didn't really, to me, feel like it reflected what it was actually like being at a silent disco for me when I was a student and I was going there and everyone was drunk and singing along together or whatever. It was a totally different. I just didn't recognize the event in these kinds of theorizations. And so that was what I was kind of reacting to, I suppose. I wanted to kind of figure out the nuances of this event a little bit more carefully.
Yeah. No, that's great. Thank you. And I mean, one of the things that I found interesting was you talk about one of the reasons why you're pushing against this sort of neoliberal totalizing model, where you're forced, the DJ acts as a sort of like the government or sort of some sort of totalitarian regime shoving a particular type of music down the throats of the masses to create an individual sort of space where you're just isolated and alienated from one another. You're together, but not really, sort of like you're locking yourself in an apartment, right? And when you lock the door, are you locking it from the outside world? Or are you locking yourself in, right? But you're just like, actually, it doesn't quite sort of make sense that you're just maximizing your individual sort of choices, considering there are multiple ways of engaging with this music. And there are sometimes 2 to 3 channels, but the main one is the 2 channels. So I thought that was a really interesting way to kind of combat that sort of model. And I also thought it was interesting that there was a sense of sort of alienation from reading the scholarship that uses it as a model, because they're critiquing a sense of alienation. So I thought there was like a meta alienation happening.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Like the
absolutely.
scholarship was alienating you from it, but the scholarship also was critiquing forms of alienation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Which why I think it's extra important to be accurate about the models, about the evidence that we're using for particular kinds of sociality, particularly if it's to do with, as you say, with alienation, because, does it help us to understand either the concept of neoliberal sociality or the silent disco itself any better is the question.
Right, right. And you get into sort of the different forms in which actually sociality occurs in a very intimate way. But before we sort of dig into that, I wanted to back up a little bit. And you kind of offer a genealogy in certain ways. And you also say that there's no particular way of offering a precise genealogy, considering like some people have laid claims to it and there's alternative histories, et cetera, et cetera. But can you lay out the genealogy of the silent disco, if you don't mind? And also, I just wanted to shout out to the amazing examples you found. I was like, how the hell did you find this stuff from the 1920s, man? Like,
Yeah.
wild.
Well, I actually have one. I have a person on Reddit to thank for one of the examples who kindly provided screenshots from a Finnish sci-fi film that I knew existed but couldn't find, and Reddit seems to be amazing for that kind of thing. Anyway, but I'll come to that. Let me do it in a slightly different order than I did in the article. So I'll start with where it actually started, where the silent disco actually was invented, which consensus is 2002. There's a guy called Nico Okkerse in the Netherlands who had a festival called the Parade, and he introduced the silent disco as a way of being able to continue later into the night without having to worry about noise complaints, because of course in a silent disco the music's being played through the headphones, so the idea is that it's going to be less loud, right? So that was, people seem to agree that's the first instance. Even then there's some kind of it's slightly contested. I actually recently got an email from someone I mentioned in a footnote who claims that Nico Okkerse stole the idea from him once in a bar in Rotterdam, and he got in touch with me 2 weeks ago to say that he'd read the article, and I don't know, he said that he liked it, but I think he probably wasn't too impressed that I shoved him in a footnote. Anyway, so that was where it happened. But you do see over the course of the 20th century the idea of a headphone party as a kind of object of fascination for some kind of futurist sci-fi types, right? Because the headphone or is this kind of symbol of privacy, of kind of privatization of listening. And on the other hand, of course, a dance party is understood to be a very social event. So this is a kind of object of fascination, even leading up to the silent disco existing. So it didn't even exist yet. But in the 1920s, you have this cartoon by a British cartoonist called Heath Robinson, who's known for kind of drawing these crazy contraptions that are kind of silly. And one that he draws is of people who all are wearing headphones, and they're like wired up to a ceiling, and that there's like a mattress over the floor, and they're all kind of it's a ceiling fan actually, and the headphones are tied up to a ceiling fan, and they're all kind of walking around as the ceiling fan spins, and it's and downstairs you see the neighbor sleeping. So already he has this idea of like a kind of silly sci-fi contraption, which is the headphone party, which is, you know, so silly that why would you ever do this? This is ridiculous, is the idea, right? And then in the 60s, of course, in general, I think technological optimism of the kind you have in the early 20th century starts to wane a little bit, and the headphone party comes up again a couple times, which is interesting. So you have this Japanese manga, this cartoon called Astro Boy, in which there's this kind of techno-fascist police state in the future that they visit, and then they have what is essentially a silent disco playing at this in this place, and everyone's like contained within their own music and not really dancing or interacting with each other. And the idea is that that's because they literally can't remember how to have fun physically. They've forgotten. So this is the kind of thing that the headphone disco or the headphone party is associated with. There's also that Finnish sci-fi film I mentioned, which again is this kind of dystopian future in which everyone's wearing headphones in public, you know?
Right.
So that's the kind of precursors that you see. And then, of course, as this technology becomes more feasible, more realistic, it actually starts to happen in all kinds of ways at live music concerts, you know, art installations in the 90s and the early noughties. But as I say, the first one, recorded one, is in 2002. And in the years after that, it really spread first among festivals and then among clubs and, you know, universities and everywhere else.
Yeah. Thank you so much for laying that out. Definitely helpful. You know, it's kind of interesting because considering this idea of noise pollution and complaints and the sort of police state and the original sort of thought behind the headphones as a form of kind of like control in different ways, there's a tension there because the use of the headphones actually subverts the law and allows to create a sort of space within the neoliberal order to sort of like experience something in different ways. And also it continues the sort of party and it lets you do this in a sort of renegade way. And it's kind of like a speakeasy in that way. It provides a space to get out of something rather than being trapped within it. So there's actually this interesting flipping of the logic, perhaps.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's something that you see in kind of the late 80s, early 90s when people first start to write about headphone listening in a kind of scholarly context, is they're really interested in this idea of the, quote, headphone bubble. So the idea that you're actually separating yourself from the outside, the outside world, as it were, creating your own kind of sonic landscape. And you're right, initially people don't really see this as a dystopian prospect. It's like, well, you know, this allows people a kind of freedom, a kind of control over their auditory environment, you know, the chance to kind of shape their own auditory world, as it were. But yes, at the same time, of course, you know, what does it mean that we're able to shut out sounds from our environment? What does this mean about the way we relate to our environment? And of course, as the years went on, people also realized that headphones really aren't as the wall between you and the rest of the world isn't actually as solid as it might seem. Like sounds leak in and out all the time. So it's kind of porous, right? Yeah.
Yep, thank you. So that's actually kind of the next question I was gonna ask you about a little bit. Actually, the architecture of the silent disco, right? I think this is a very helpful way of talking about it because the architecture is the construction, but also the ecology of the sort of participants in the room, which also includes the DJs. And later on, you talk about this really great conception of sort of the battlefield and whatnot, and this sort of like different, not necessarily identity politics in a way, but like how different sort of social characteristics grant different sort of value schemas within the silent disco space. I'm sure we'll talk about that, but I guess also in the genealogy, you sort of explore there is subversion within the silent disco or use of headphones because it was originally you talked about it serving as a form of grassroots activism within environmental spaces as well. So I just want to shout that out as another form of subversion that seems important. Um, I guess my question is kind of would you mind talking about the architecture of the silent disco and the ways in which people relate to the environment, how the environment bleeds in, how vulnerability works in these spaces as well, and what happened in the story when you took your headphones off?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, as I say, we have this idea, or well, some people have this idea, or certainly did, that headphones create this, what you might call a kind of hermetically sealed environment, sonic space, right? Or a virtual space. So when you put on your headphones, you're like contained and the outside world is kind of not there anymore. And so the conceit of the silent disco then would be, well, you know, your music's coming through your headphones, you're in your own space, you're in your own virtual space. And that was the basis of a lot of the kind of critical theory writing of the silent disco that I mentioned, is like this idea that people are kind of siloing themselves off from the rest of the world or from the rest of the room. I found this to not particularly be the case, or at least not so straightforwardly. So, of course, on the one hand, everyone is in control of their own music. They're in control of their own auditory environment. But then these sounds kind of leak because people sing, especially when they're drunk, they sing, right? And the silent disco is not a particularly quiet place to be at the best of times. Like people are singing, people are, you know, dancing. There's kind of environmental sounds. So silent disco is to an observer not particularly silent. And so what you see is that people, even when they're on different channels, different headphone channels, listening to different music, I mean, are very aware of each other. And especially if they're friends, they will try to like coax each other onto the same channel because they want to be experiencing the same thing, because it might strengthen their kind of social connection, right? So people are using this headphone virtual space as a way of kind of getting closer to each other. Sharing virtual space means becoming kind of socially closer somehow. And there's this thing that happens sometimes, which I called the teenage dream effect, I think.
Yes.
I don't think some of these terms are going to catch on really, but anyway. And which is kind of what happened when I was listening to one channel, or me and my friends were, or whatever. And then the song Teenage Dream by Katy Perry evidently came on the other channel, or the chorus started or something, and everyone else started to sing along. And that's when we kind of realized that Teenage Dream was playing, because they kind of burst our headphone bubble, as it were, with their singing. And so, you know, people would kind of switch over because they'd be like, oh my God, it's Katy Perry. And we were listening to, you know, Mumford and Sons or whatever it was. And so what you see is that like the physical space, the physical environment in which people are dancing and singing along kind of overlaps with, intrudes the private, quote unquote, private virtual spaces that are being created by the headphones. And this is kind of part of the point of the silent disco, right? That people kind of sing at each other and switch channels because of these social dynamics. So the sociality there is part of the point. But as you say, there's also a kind of vulnerability involved in the singing, right? Because the music's not playing through the speakers. And so theoretically, you can kind of hear each other singing quite well if you wanted to. But everyone's wearing their headphones, so that's not really something that you would generally hear. And there's another thing I write about where I Believe in a Thing Called Love by The Darkness is playing, and everyone's kind of trying to do the falsetto, and that would be really embarrassing in any other context. But everyone's like, well, no one can hear me. And so what happened when I took my headphones off as a kind of, you know, because I was doing research, I guess, I took my headphones off and I got some like really dirty looks, and people kind of like walked away from me because they were like, what the hell, man? The whole point of this is that you're not listening. And the whole point of this is that we're sharing this virtual kind of headphone space. And I just kind of there's this very delicate architecture of like the physical space we're sharing, the virtual space, and the headphones that we're sharing. And by taking my headphones off, I just kind of collapsed it. And people don't like it when you do that. So that's kind of interesting because, again, it challenges this idea that just because we're all wearing headphones, we are separated from one another spatially. It doesn't seem to be the case.
Right. No, thank you. I'm kind of also interested in, I love that story also. There seems to be a sense in which you wear the headphones and you have to play a part in the spectacle. Like, you know that this is happening, but you sort of have to play along with it. In a way, it reminds me of a sort of Hegelian conception of God, where it's like God exists insofar as the community believe God exists. So it's like the
Yeah.
silent disco exists insofar as we believe the silent disco
I think that's
exists.
right, though. That seems right. Yeah.
Yeah, which also speaks to sense of community. So I also found, I was curious, like, this doesn't seem like a romantic space, right? Um, and I think like clubs, you talk about gender and whatnot. We'll get into this specifically, the question of gender, but it seems to be like the romantic politics or something like this are not necessarily there. And this is different from the sort of typical club. So you talk about physical proximity happening differently. So in the silent disco, people are more spaced out. Um, and maybe this is, I mean, I don't know if this is a particular thing because of the silent disco or the architecture of it. But is this like anything related to COVID in some sort of strange way also? Or is that just a random thought?
That's a good question. I wasn't going to clubs before COVID, so I kind of don't know. Um, so, I mean, the only thing I would say is that normal club nights seem to not exhibit the same kind of. It does seem to be more spatially proximate in kind of
Yeah.
normal club nights.
What do you think accounts for that? Why are people more distant, physically? So it's like, I don't know. This isn't a one-to-one thing, but it seems like something like the closer you could be really close virtually, but you won't be close physically. And also, it seems like you're dancing, generally speaking, in groups, right? A lot of times you're with friends or with groups or something like this. This isn't a date night. Um, and yeah, I mean, why is that sort of thing happening? What do you
Um,
think?
well, I mean, one thing that you get a lot in like scholarship around clubbing, I know Luis Manuel Garcia says something. I mean, I'm going to kind of butcher this, but the music kind of acts as a sort of connective tissue between all the participants of a regular club, right? Because it's the music is so loud and so bassy that it's a kind of it's a really a physical experience, right? You actually feel the bass in your body and you kind of feel it coming through the floor. And there's so the sound is actually this really material thing that seems to kind of connect everyone in that moment. And so what I would think is that encourages people to be closer because it just simply feels as if there is less space between them anyway because of the sound, right? Whereas in a silent disco, it's really just here in your head, you know. Often people have it. You can actually control your own volume too, so it might not even be very loud for a lot of people. So I think that will be one factor. The other factor I think is to do with the fact that if you're listening to different music, it does kind of feel like you're in different spaces and therefore can't quite get as close because, you know, the virtual spaces don't align. So those are my two ideas.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's super helpful. I just was thinking about how there's sort of this potential mind-body duality thing happening within these spaces, because it seems like clubs, there's a sort of more bodily connection to the music, perhaps, whereas this is sort of something, I don't know, you sing, it's focused on the ears. I guess it's something like because the ways in which you hear the music, the body might react differently,
Yeah.
something like that.
Well, I mean, and in fairness to the kind of critical theorists at this point, like it has been pretty well documented that people report somewhat of a loss of subjectivity in clubs, or they kind of feel as though they lose something of a sense of self in these kinds of spaces. That might just be
Right.
because they're on drugs, but it could also be because of the music. Whereas in silent discos, really, you are constantly being reminded of the fact that you're an individual, that you have control, this kind of thing. So, yeah. That is a big
Right.
difference.
There also seems to be this thing where anonymity still plays a role within sort of this individualized space, because you could sing and no one will hear you or something like this, right? Unless there's this breach of the headphone taking off. And also being able to scream at each other is part of it, right? And this leaks in. And this gets to sort of my next question. I was curious about a few different things. One of the things I wanted to ask about, that seems to be a nice, relatively nice segue, is these multi-channel, the dynamics, the social dynamics, and the psychosocial dynamics regarding these two various channels. And there seems to be something about light happening here, the green and the blue you mentioned, and groups group cohesion, where there's people listening to the green channel, but then there's someone singing the blue channel, for this sort of humorous effect and to show a sense of individuality, and kind of this also sense of coolness too. So I wonder, get into talking about things like, there's a lot within these blue and green channels that you get into. There's a sort of pseudo war, that takes place at different levels. If there's a university performance, it's a different type of war than the DJs at these corporate sort of instantiations of it. And then also, if you wouldn't mind talking, this is a lot. So if you wouldn't mind talking about how gender plays a role in this, and also coolness or a sense of defiance,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, okay, so first of all, I'll just outline. So when I talk about these two channel silent discos where you've got two choices of music, often the two colors are blue and green in my experience. I mean, there's no reason why it can't be different colors, but the ones that I use are blue and green for these main two channels of the silent disco. And yeah, like what was interesting to me initially, even before I started going to these silent discos, is that I would get marketing emails about them. And often they would really play into this idea. That was like their main USP, was the fact that like you've got two channels and there's like a battle going on in between these two channels, and you're like picking sides. And one of them is the blue one, which is like pop anthems, guilty pleasures, and the other one is the green one, which is like cool indie music, right? So this is the kind of framework that they're setting up, kind of as you come in. And yeah, you do find that this dynamic, or this kind of imagined dynamic, comes back in lots of different ways in the room. So first of all, yeah, what did you ask about? Yeah, so there's like the kinds of music that you would find that in the blue channel and the green channel respectively, that is like a heavily gendered, also a racialized kind of divide. So blue channel music, I mean, when I say pop anthems, guilty pleasures, like historically, of course, these kinds of aesthetics are associated with femininity, with like teenage female audiences particularly, and this is the kind of music that you would find there. And then when we talk about like cool indie music, we're often talking about music by men, masculinist kind of indie guitar music from the 2000s. It's important to note, like, I'm not talking about actual indie music. It's all relative to one another, you know, like, and the same thing when we're talking about coolness, like, I don't think anyone would actually call the silent disco as a whole a cool event, really. So we're talking about like relative coolness within this space, within this like closed off space, right? And so it's interesting that these kind of gender dynamics then inform the choices that people make on these channels, and what is kind of positioned as the cool one and what is positioned as the non-cool one, and how that then influences the way people socialize with each other. One thing that you'd see, for example, is that if there's two people on a different channel while everyone else around them is on the same one, they might have this like moment of connection. Or similarly, that, you know, their friends might then kind of really performatively or ironically kind of shout at them to get them to switch. And so you see this like there's this oppositionality which everyone sort of partakes in as like it's a game or something, but that this is ultimately a dynamic that seems to encourage sociality or connection in some way. So again, you see like individualism and connection are kind of in this weird tension. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. And so before the event even occurs, there's this prescribed kind of idea of the battle that takes place. And this battle seems to be sort of important for just the overall social dynamics of the evening, sort of like who dances with who. And you don't see this sort of thing. You see this thing sort of in different club settings. Sometimes they'll do like reggaeton versus like dembow or some music like this. There's like, these like Fever on Fever, the app, they'll say like these different sort of club events that are occurring, at least in the States, they have stuff like this. And that'll be like, different rappers versus one another. Or it seems to be another iteration of sort of battle of the bands, but really the winner is, the company making all of the money, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because it's not actually, the DJs aren't actually battling usually. Like they both know exactly what they're doing, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's something I wanted to ask you about as well. So you talk about sort of like the whiteness and the erasure, like of blackness within these spaces, right? I don't know if it's a level on the level of performance or affordability or access, but it's also on the level of audibility as well. And I was wondering if you could talk about, I guess, that, and also the ways in which DJs play upon one another, and whether or not participants know that, or if they realize they're being played in some sort of way and they're just going along with it, or whatever this might be.
Yeah. Well, so to your first point, the separation of the two channels ultimately is about mainstream and fringe, right? And this dynamic is just about one channel is the mainstream, the basic thing, and the other one is the fringe, the kind of cool, weird thing. And so what you see is like, white artists, also like, like conventionally queer coded artists, which you might call like guilty pleasures, the kind of pop stuff that'll be on the blue channel, and then anything that is kind of a little weird or a little strange would then be green. So you'd find there is this kind of racial dynamic of like black music as an other, for example, hip hop music as a kind of other, which is then you tend to find on this other channel, even though it doesn't really bear any musical resemblance to like Arctic Monkeys, which is like the typical kind of indie music that you'd find there. So it's just interesting what people instinctively, and I don't think they're really thinking about this, right, at Silent Social Incorporated, but they're like, they are clearly subconsciously like, what do we think is like the weird music? And it's interesting the kind of things that you then find, the kind of patterns that you find in what people think of as weird music, and what that actually has to do with how it sounds, and what that has more to do with like the identities of the people who made it. And then wait, what was the other part of your question?
Oh, I think it was something about the DJs working together and whether or not the people know about these sorts of things, or yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so the analogy that I kind of use is live action role play,
Yes.
which I think kind of works pretty well for this. So I don't think that anyone is under any illusions that there's actually a DJ battle going on. I'm not really sure most people are thinking about the DJs existing at all. Like they're on the stage and they're wearing these headphones too, but like I don't really think people are thinking about the DJs as people. They're just thinking about these two options, these two sides. And so I think generally people would think of it in terms of blue and green and these two sides, rather than there being these two kind of leaders, as it were, who, as I write in the piece, are they don't really try too hard to keep up this facade that they're actually, battling with each other. There's one point where the DJ would be like, oh, I'm just playing all the modern crap and whatever, and like this kind of thing. So I think they're quite aware of the dynamic that they're producing, but just like in live action role play, like everyone's aware of it, but the idea is actually that you're co-creating a battle for the sake of it's a social event, right? LARPing is social, so you're creating staging a battle for the sake of everyone kind of connecting with each other. I think it's very similar to what's happening at the silent disco. The oppositionality is ultimately about forging a kind of connection through partisanship, which, again, I guess you could ask like more kind of ideologically charged questions about like, what does it mean that we seek connection through like oppositionality towards an outside group, that kind of thing. But that is, I think, what's happening.
Yeah, and eventually you sort of go on to be like, actually, it's not the opposition within the silent disco that's this sort of ulterior space. The entire thing is actually the ulterior space. So you sort of open up the metaphysical plane to then talk about the silent disco itself as a sort of marker of uniqueness. It's to go to this event is a sign of sort of uniqueness, whether how you participate in the event, it's already unique, right? So it seems like when you're in that space, it becomes a subculture
Right.
already.
Yeah. And again, like not a particularly cool one. But yes, there is a moment at the end where, when everyone's together, everyone ends up on the same channel because they switch one off about 10 minutes before the end. Well, a bit more than that. Then everyone kind of ends up in the same space. And then suddenly the silent disco is the outside, and then everywhere else is the mainstream, which in fairness kind of is how it started, right? Like the whole idea is that late night entertainment had to be kind of silenced for the sake of the rest of the population surrounding a music festival. So it kind of makes sense, right? That the silent disco as an event would position itself as kind of on the fringe of something, because that kind of is what it was initially.
Right, right. As we keep talking about silent disco, the word silence keeps feeling more and more odd because none of this is silent. It's sort of silent for whom in some way, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So perhaps there could be a better name for this, even though it's quite kind of catchy as a marketing technique and whatnot. Like headphone party sounds odd or something,
I know. I think I played with the idea of referring to it as a headphone disco, kind of to make the point, right? Because
Yes.
it's not silent in any meaningful way, except in a legal sense that it doesn't, breach noise regulations.
Right. Which again subverts this idea of it being just a manifestation of a police state, a techno-fascist state, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, right, exactly. But I mean, yeah, I was like, headphone, am I really going to use a different term? And then people, again, like it just isn't, I just thought it was stupid. I was like, I'll just call it that. But you're right. The silence part of it is actually immaterial in the end to the experience of the event, I find.
Right, right. And I also thought when it was sort of constructing these ulterior kind of identities through hip hop and stuff, I thought it was interesting that you mentioned it's not known or realized, it's subconscious, which is acts as a form of naturalizing these various like ideological positions because it's very like Althusserian. It's sort of like the more natural it is, the more ideological it is.
Yeah.
That's thing.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So I was just struck by this isn't necessarily a question I had in mind before, but this erasure of the DJs I find really interesting. Is there anything you could say? How do DJs become erased? Why? It also, I mean, the idea is sort of like the music is happening more in the mind in this sort of in this silent disco rather than of the body. I was wondering if like the DJs sort of are erased because they're bodies that get in the way of the music of the mind or something happening here. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know. I was wondering if there's something to that. If not, we can move on to a question.
No, I think there's something in that. I think there's probably two things going on. So the first is definitely that just having headphones on, like I think people just associate headphones with private listening just because that's how they would use them in their day-to-day lives. And so the idea that I think it's easy to forget when you're wearing headphones that that there's someone actually controlling that music, as opposed to it coming through the speakers, and then you look up at the sound source and there's a guy right next to the sound source standing there playing the music, right? So I think that's part of it. I think also the play, like the process of what songs are played at silent discos, that it's so it's so kind of ritualized. It's so almost predictable what these two sides are going to do, that it's just, you forget that there's a person. I think that's part of it. It's just like when you hear a song that you don't like, you just switch over. You don't stop to be like, oh, what's this guy doing or something, because I think there's an understanding of what happens at these events. Again, it's like it's a staged spectacle. It's not really like clubbing in that sense. So I think because the rules of the game are so clear, I think it's easier to forget that there's a decision maker there. But it's certainly also about bodies and about the kind of the music feeling somehow as though it's more attached to your own body. Yeah.
No, that's great. That's really helpful. Thank you. And I was also kind of curious with DJs how they work together in different ways, right? They seem oppositional, but as you said in the article, one's going to the bathroom or having a smoke. They'll take over their sort of stuff, right? And then also this gets into, we should popularize it, the teenage dream effect, where one song sort of overpowers the other. And it's a very purposeful thing. Like one DJ will play a quote unquote weaker song, and the other one will play like a real sort of crowd pleaser to get everybody on the same page. And this creates a sense of sort of collective identity within the space that is usually, again, laid bare as sort of neoliberal individuality, in a very like Adornian sort of sense. So yeah, I mean, if you wouldn't mind talking about these sort of moments of kind of purposeful cohesion and collectivity.
Sure. Yeah. Well, again, so what's happening in silent disco is like they're trying to kind of curate an experience for people in which they can enjoy a kind of staged oppositionality, or a kind of staged marginality of one channel as opposed to another. So because people kind of take pleasure in being the one who's doing something different, or being in a group of people who are doing something different, or encouraging their friends to do the same thing as them. People enjoy that tension. And so the idea is that the DJs, what they have to do is constantly maintain a mainstream and a fringe. And that's what this dynamic between the two channels is about. And that's also what they're doing when, for example, one of them plays a really big song. The other one doesn't actually respond by playing another big song, because that means that people are actually missing out in some way, right? Because of this kind of battle dynamic. The battle dynamic can't get in the way of people actually enjoying themselves. And so they kind of play in on each other, like you said. So one of them will play their strong song, the other one will play a weaker song, just so there's always one channel where most people are, right? So that you can have this dynamic of like inside outside, as opposed to two sides that are actually always equal. So often when you'd look around a silent disco, you'd see most people are on one channel as opposed to the other. I suppose mathematically that would always be the case, but like you can really see that there's one that's dominating most of the time, because that's the conceit of the event, I guess. It's about finding or creating a sense of community among like staged oppositions.
Right. No, that's great. Thank you. And I was kind of curious within these sort of moments, you talk about fleeting moments of connection, and also how long this sort of oppositional listening sometimes lasts as well. So whenever there's sort of a strong song playing, someone might defiantly listen to another to construct a sense of social capital of otherness or something, on it. And so I was wondering if you wouldn't mind talking about like sort of the ways in which the idea of social capital sort of works within this space of the silent disco, and also the how long what these fleeting connections mean. Just because it's sort of like in a club, you might listen to a song and make friends or something like this. But here it seems to be more you stick with the people you came with, or at least that's the way it was posed,
Right.
in the article as I read it. So
Yeah.
yeah, those two sorts of things. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, so what happens with social capital, and of course, again, we're talking about like relative social capital. I'm not trying to claim that it's like actually cool to listen to the Arctic Monkeys in 2026, but like, let's say,
Right.
in this kind of environment, there's a sense of alterity, of coolness that you would gain from like being one of the few people who's listening to something different, right? So like everyone's on the Blue Channel listening to like ABBA, and you're like, oh no, I don't want to listen to ABBA. I want to do something different. And that's like visibly, like you're visibly, you look different in that moment because your headphones have a different color on them, right? And so what I would see happen often is that if there's two people who are in that situation, they might kind of point on each other and be like, hey, we're both doing this different thing. And then, that would last until one of them switches. So that would last not very long, usually, because as you say, like a silent disco is not the kind of place where you'd go to make friends, and also not really the kind of place where you can like talk to anyone, even in the way that you can at a club, where it's like you can just shout at each other in a club.
Right.
And kind of get somewhere. You can't really in a silent disco because you'd have to take your headphone off, and then that, as I said, is its own weird thing of like you're not really supposed to do that, so you'd have to like go outside. So these are fleeting moments of connection over like a shared alterity, which is interesting, I think, not because they're like really deep social connections or anything, but just because again, there's like there's just a tension between, on the one hand, what we think of as this very kind of neoliberal individualist conception of social capital, which is like, I'm doing something different, I'm not like everyone else, and like encouraging people to behave in that way feels kind of ideologically very charged. But then also this dynamic, or this like way of being, often causes these moments of connection between people. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, no, that's really great. Thank you. But it just sort of makes me think that like it's a place to sort of strengthen bonds that already are occurring rather than create new bonds or something like this. So maybe weird question, but can you go alone?
Well, so I did go alone.
Nice.
Sometimes on purpose, mostly, one time because my friend wasn't allowed in, so I had to go alone.
Right. Yeah, that's a funny story.
Yeah. So I wouldn't recommend it. I would say no, you can't really, because again, well, it's like you say. So people go with their friends in order to like have a good time with their friends. I think one of my interviewees said it was like playing mini golf, which I think is broadly correct. Like, I don't think you would play mini golf alone. I don't think you would go to mini golf to make new friends. It's not just because you're not drinking. It's because it's something that you do in groups, right? And these dynamics happen mostly within groups. So to go on your own, it's just there's nothing connecting you to other people, really. There's not really an easy way of approaching strangers in a silent disco, I would say. Again, apart from this kind of like this shared virtual space thing does offer some connection, but it's not really enough to like go and make friends with someone, really. So I would not want to go to a silent disco alone. If I had to choose, I would rather go to a club alone than to a silent disco. Probably wouldn't want to do either, though, frankly.
Of course, of course. It's funny, it's, so many people go to clubs or whatever it might be for fun or a Friday night, but here we are going for sort of field work and ethnomusicological purposes.
Yeah. Well, there was a point where I was I had my notebook out before I realized it's obviously way more practical to take notes on your phone. I had my notebook out, and one of the security guys was like, "Why are you being weird? Can you like people?" It's like, I think people are going to be kind of freaked out by the fact that you've got your notebook out and then you're like occasionally taking your headphones off. And I was like, you know what? Fair enough.
Right, right. Definitely creates more of a sense of ulterior already. Rather than just listening to different music, you have a notebook taking notes, who is doing what sort of thing.
Yeah, God, that's the ultimate social capital, is to be an ethnomusicologist at the no, anyway.
Yeah, and there's so many different versions of just different sort of ideas of fields as well, right? There's some people even use the virtual space of like Grand Theft Auto and different like World of Warcraft as the field. So not too different in this regard, right? Another virtual.
No, no, exactly. I kind of played with the idea of including a metaphor, which I kind of took out because it felt like it was slightly coming out of the blue. But the idea of what are they called again? Like uh, massive multiplayer
Oh, like the
games.
RPG
Yeah,
business
like
and
Club
yeah,
Penguin or something. Um,
right.
and I kind of like silent discos are not totally unlike that in that they offer this kind of virtual world in which you know, people connect with one another, but they can also step out of it. And it's also not like you also wouldn't go to Club Penguin alone necessarily. You might go with your friends and that kind of thing. So anyway, it felt a little labored in the end, but you're right. There's something about the virtual space of the video game and also uh, the kind of staged or no, the kind of manufactured dynamics of the video game that are not unlike those of the silent disco.
Yeah, and I was actually thinking back to the video game and video games being virtual space, and you're in physical virtual space in the silent disco. When you're playing a video game in virtual space, you're sort of apart from others, obviously, right? You're sitting in your own chair, et cetera, et cetera. You're in different rooms, perhaps. Maybe that could be a reason why the physical distance occurs, because that's how we all usually are already within virtual spaces, is something that just struck me.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. Although, like, yeah, we're talking about virtual, like the physical space of like maybe half a meter, like a meter instead of half a meter. You know what I mean? Like, it's
Sure.
not like we're on like other ends of the room. It's just like you wouldn't necessarily be touching each other. Um, so there's something about physical touch, I think, that is
Right.
lack
Okay,
of
so I
physical
might be
touch.
making it more dramatic than it is.
Well, no. I mean, I think it's a good point. I'm just thinking out loud about how um, it's also to do with the fact that you're not touching each other as opposed to just the actual physical distance between you. Um, if you see what I mean. But
Yeah. No,
yeah,
of course. I just want to make sure I'm also respectful of your time and
it's
whatnot.
all good.
Uh, Greatly thankful for you being here.
It's,
I could probably ask you a million questions
I have
more.
time. It's all good.
Oh, great, great,
Yeah.
great. I was also curious about this idea of the sort of you use the metaphor, I think, like quite well. It's not even really a metaphor. You have blue, you have green, and then you're like these turquoise moments, right, where everybody sort of comes together. And also, there's a sense in which in the story you lay out, you're like it's 2:47. The people that aren't that have never came to the silent disco like don't know what's going on, but I do. So there's this like insider outsider thing
Yeah.
happening in the silent disco. I wonder if you could talk about these insider outsider sort of relationships where it's like the first time you go, the second time, what to expect, and also these moments of turquoiseness where the blue and the green become one,
Yeah.
like the other channel's cut off.
Definitely, yeah. So what happens towards the end of the night traditionally is one of the channels, the green one, always would shut off. So everyone is forced onto the same channel. And what that does is it kind of plays out in a kind of enlarged form all of the dynamics that have been happening in miniature form across the course of the night. So um as I mentioned, so sharing virtual space kind of affords a certain kind of social proximity, and so at the end, this is afforded to everyone at the same time because they're all on the same channel now, right? And again, if we're talking about this staged oppositionality between blue and green, um, this is sort of eliminated, and everyone ends up being on the same team, as it were, at the end, and so um, it's supposed to create this kind of grand finale type feeling where everyone is all together. And often this will be accompanied by so I've called it turquoise moments. Maybe I just explain that. So these are songs that kind of combine features of the music that would be on the blue channel and on the green channel. So it's music that kind of would fit into either, and it's a sort of combination of both. Ultimate example is Mr. Brightside by the Killers, right? Huge pop song, but also the Killers are this kind of ambiguously indie rock band, of like dudes, and it's kind of like dude music, but it's also this huge pop hit. So anyway, that's the kind of thing that they would definitely play towards the end of the night. Angels by Robbie Williams, like, this kind of thing.
Right.
And so what that does is, it puts everyone on the same kind of side of the staged battle. And what the DJs will often then say is like, oh, go and tell your friends about us, and like go and, we've all just experienced something together. And so it's kind of endowing the silent disco itself with this sense of alterity, of outsiderness, as like in relation to the rest of the world, which is sort of interesting. And I sort of write about that slightly, not tongue in cheek, but from the perspective that you would experience this at 2:47 a.m., right? Which is like, oh wow, we've all just experienced something together, and isn't this amazing? Uh, you know, it's like it's not a huge subcultural kind of super cool event, but it can make people feel as though it was, which in itself is kind of interesting. And another thing that, well, this is slightly separate, but what would happen just as I finished the research is silent discos in Oxford where I live kept getting cancelled because they hadn't sold enough tickets. So
Yeah.
clearly this idea of like, go home and tell your friends about this cool thing you just witnessed wasn't actually working very well, because I actually don't know if they even do them anymore. I think they just sort of quietly stopped selling enough tickets to be able to do it.
Yeah, that was actually something I was curious about, sort of like where are they at? What kind of fad is this, right? So we know that for some writers, it represents basically a modality of neoliberal consumption and consumerism. But also there's a sense of individuality, collectivism, solidarity, dissonance, all of these things baked into the actual sort of phenomenological experience of it. But then we also have, if we're talking about sort of the end of this in some way, a kind of also failure of neoliberal capitalism to capture, just because if not enough people are going to this, it's not selling enough, right? So there's so many interesting kind of contradictions within this model as well.
Yeah, that's right. Which I think it's important. That's why it's important to kind of um, be very clear, like where you're starting your analogy from, or like whether you're starting from the abstract and applying your abstract kind of theory to this particular musical phenomenon, or whether you're actually starting from the event and then extrapolating outwards from, okay, well, what kind of sociality is actually at play here? Because what I find is like, it's absolutely fine to say, there's certain elements of the silent disco that are, play into feelings of individualism, of kind of atomized sociality that reflect these developments. Um, but to understand it as the embodiment of those things is to really flatten some of the kind of more collectivist, more social stuff that goes on within it, and also doesn't really help you, I think, to understand neoliberalism and what it's doing any better, right? Because it's really complex. I mean, it's true of a lot of things. Like it's true of how people talk about headphone culture in general. Like I remember there being quite a lot of discourse not so long ago about whether or not headphones were like tools of fascism, because you were, kind of shutting out you were, shutting out kind of unwanted sounds from your environment, and it was this kind of disciplining thing. Or people talk about, pop music concerts being like religious experiences, or like a replacement for kind of religious ritual. And it's like the answer to all of those things, boringly, is probably like in some ways yeah, and in some ways no.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to actually reflect that, because otherwise, um, what are you gaining from the work, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think those are excellent points considering that have to do with both sort of writing the research and not foreclosing kind of ideas, right? And stretching it to the point where like you're studying this thing, but like you're forcing this methodology on something that doesn't work. So I think that's actually a great sort of researching point as well, to constantly reevaluate the model in which you're using. Uh, which is why I like to think sort of dialectically, because it's baked in that there's sort of no um, closing in before you're kind of done, and then you're never really done, this sort of
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with that. And it's like important to say, like I remember when I was working on this and someone told me like, well, you can't be against analogy per se. Like comparing things to other things is like how we think about anything. Like um you can't reject the idea of comparing something to something else. Of course that's true. It's just about the order in which you're making the comparison, right? I suppose.
Yeah. No, that's great. Thank you so much. And I was just kind of curious, I guess, could start closing things out. Um, what are some other things that you're sort of working on? And what are you thinking about? And I guess before we move on completely, do you have a favorite song that comes up during the silent disco? One of your guilty pleasures, if you would reveal it.
That's that's a really good question. Uh, I mean, I like, I don't know. There's so much of that music is like 2000s, 2010s club music. Um, so you get a lot of like Katy Perry, Rihanna, Calvin Harris, and this kind of thing. I like when they kind of throw it back a little bit to like the 90s. I like that. I like very, very occasionally you get them to play like A Tribe Called Quest,
Nice.
which I enjoy just because it's something different. Um, I think also a powerful song for probably near the end is like I Will Survive. I think that's a great club track and underplayed, I think. So those would be my two, I'd say. But yeah, you don't always get them.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear that Tribe Called Quest gets thrown in there as well. I mean, there's a sense in which kind of maybe perhaps a sort of nostalgia works its way into the playlist as well. And also, these are the songs that probably the people that grew up kind of like these were the songs that when we were younger, like were perhaps associated with the club, with partying, and then we get to sort of experience them later on rather than playing like new music. It's very much playing into like the demographic and age group and things. Yeah, very much so. So yeah, I mean, thank you so much. This is a really fun article and an understudied topic, and I think that's great to open something up that was kind of fetishized in different ways, you know. Um, so I guess what are you working on now, if anything, right? And it doesn't have to be academic, just in general.
No. I mean, yeah, I've got some musical projects that I'm doing, recording some stuff with my sister at the moment, who's a bassist. So that's
Nice.
good. Academically, yeah, I'm doing a big project now on hipsterism in popular music. So looking at like actually not totally dissimilarly to what we were just talking about, looking at like aesthetics of like alterity of outsiderness as they are utilized in like some very mainstream popular music and how this works and what exactly is like desirable about that kind of hipsterist positioning or like yeah hipsterism in kind of commercial settings. So that's what I've been working on now. I've actually also been doing a lot about like seancing, musical seancing and death. I've been reading a lot about today, Rosemary Brown and stuff.
Yeah.
She has a great memoir about how, Frederick Chopin used to come and visit her
Mm.
and tell her new pieces that he'd written in the 1970s. Um, so that's been good. All kinds of stuff, really. Nothing much on the silent disco now, but who knows? Maybe there'll be kind of follow up stuff because I think there's a lot still to be kind of done to do it completely. I mean, I obviously did a case study of a very geographically specific area, um, and a fairly limited. I mean, I couldn't do everything, so I'm sure there's plenty more to do.
Yeah. That's another sort of route of questioning. Like, we could have taken sort of like, what do you think is particular about this UK scene and whatnot with this? That's something I also had in mind. I think, yeah, with hipsters, I think that's a great topic to kind of study and look at. I think of like sort of the jazz scene, 1920s, 1930s, like Harry the Hipster. Uh, blackness and hipster stuff. There's someone named, I think her name is, I believe, Cody Spinner, and she wrote a lot about seances and music as well.
Oh, cool.
Good person to check out for
All right,
that.
I will check that out. Yeah.
Yeah, I did grad school with her. But anyway,
Oh, nice.
yeah, sorry, say that again?
I just said nice. That sounds good.
Yeah. So anything else you sort of want to add before we conclude, or where people could find your work and keep up with things you do?
I don't know. Yeah, I have a website, maxblansjaar.com. So I just put everything on there. I used to do everything off like Instagram, and I'm still on Instagram, but I thought it's good to have a website in case the whole social media thing implodes at some point. So my website is good, and then everything links off of there, so you can see everything that I do. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And yeah, the social media thing, it seems like it is imploding in various ways. And
I'm sure it will. Yeah. I think it'll probably be a really good thing when it does.
I know, I'm excited. I can't wait.
Yeah.
But I know one of the top downloaded apps right now is like a sort of, it's like a Palestinian social media platform that sort of pushes back against all of the silencing and et cetera, censorship that's happening around that. So it's great stuff. But thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. This was a lot of fun. And any other projects, just come and hang out and we'll chat.
Lovely. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Have a good one.
Cheers. You too.
Bye bye.
Bye.